Greetings, everybody. Welcome to Forces of Evolutionary Change. This is the second Prezi within our evolution unit. Before we get started, I want to take a look at the big picture so that you can start to think about how you might want to organize your notes. We're going to be discussing natural selection again because it is one of those forces of evolutionary change in organism populations. The second thing is called genetic drift. We'll also be discussing gene flow, and finally we'll discuss sexual selection, which is closely related to natural selection. This will make more sense later on. Big questions: how has the theory of evolution been expanded since Darwin and his discovery of the Galapagos Island finches? Why does evolution of organisms, specifically populations of organisms, occur? And how does evolution affect a population? The road to neo-Darwinism. Darwin wasn't the last evolutionary biologist. A lot of things were left unexplained after he published The Origin of Species. And this was because Charles Darwin's work was before Gregor Mendel's work of Mendelian genetics. At the time, Charles Darwin could only explain his observations on the macro level, if you will. He wasn't able to understand how things were passed on from generation to generation. And so now what we call neo-Darwinism is just, it refers to the modern theory of evolution or the modern synthesis. So what we're going to do in class is we're going to be explaining evolution in genetic terms. And so the most important thing that you write down so far is the definition for evolution. So evolution is written here: change in genetic characteristics of a population over time. In class, I will replace the term genetic characteristics for what those are actually referring to, and those are allele frequencies. So if you hear me do that in class to change the definition to change in allelic frequencies of a population over time, both of those things are accurate. I just like to say allele frequencies because they're more specific. Looking now at an example of evolution would just be change in beak depth of medium ground finch on Daphne major following a drought. If you look in 1976, this is fairly recently, the average beak depth was somewhere between 8.5 and 9, so probably 8.9 or so millimeters. And shortly after a drought, in 1978, the average beak depth was over 9.5 millimeters. That just means that that was selected for whenever there was not very much rain. There seems to be an advantage of those individuals that were already born with a larger beak size, and so they were more likely to survive eating food and reproduce, passing along those genes. It can be a good idea to practice looking at images that you are unfamiliar with. So looking at this, the generations are listed here on the x-axis. So over the course of generations in this computer simulation, we've got allele frequency. So you could think of these in terms of percentages. So this would be like 100% of all of the alleles, meaning all of the different versions of genes in a particular population. And you can see as the generations go on, a particular allele might become more or less frequent. Typically that will depend on the environment, but as you'll see later in this presentation, that's not always the case. So if you were to look at this yellow allele, the frequency increases a little bit, and then about the 15th generation it begins to stabilize, whereas you see this allele frequency of this tan allele. I'm not sure what this represents, but that decreases over the course of generations. So perhaps that did not convey a selective advantage. Now for the fun to begin. So if we define evolution as the change in genetic characteristics or the change in allelic frequencies of a population over time, then natural selection cannot be the only way that a population can evolve. Natural selection is definitely one force of evolution. And so what it is traits that improve survival or reproductive fitness are going to accumulate in a population. So this is a change to a population that is both selective meaning the environment is going to be very particular, if you will, and it results in organisms that are better adapted to their particular environment. So that's what that adaptive change means. And so there are a bunch of examples of natural selection. If that's something that you're still struggling with to understand, I'm happy to review that more with you individually. It's important to note that even though most of the time we talk about things that are pretty obvious to see, such as coloration or speed, there are many other things that nature, if you will, can select for. So predation selection will act on both the predator and the prey. So camouflage, mimicry, we'll go over that more later on in this unit. Being quick to get away or to chase down your prey, as well as defenses. We also have physiological selection. So things like disease resistance is a form of natural selection. The use of oxygen and food and water, so physiological efficiency. Biochemical versatility, protection from injury, and morphology, meaning anatomy. So all of those things can be influenced by natural selection. It's also kind of cool to note that coevolution does take place. So as you have prey that might be the population of prey of one species might be adapting to its particular environment and the pressures of the predators trying to consume it, you also have predators evolving at the same time. And so that's what we refer to as coevolution. Two or more species reciprocally affect each other's evolution, and that could be for good or for bad, if you will. But predator-prey, competition, as well as symbiosis are all examples of coevolution. This image here, you can see that we've got different sampling sites, so different places that people went, so look down at this image, to collect samples on Long Sound Island, excuse me. And here's the Atlantic Ocean. And so what we see is that as we get closer and closer to the opening for the ocean, salinity, that means the amount of salt, is going to increase. And so that's just what we see because the ocean does contain so much salt. But if you look up here, there are alleles. So these are versions of genes. Okay, so we've got this purple version, and then we've got they just clump together all the other the types of alleles into this green coloration. So look at this pattern here. So allele frequencies, it seems like we have a higher frequency of this LAP94 allele as we get to these higher numbers. So let's look closely and see what these higher numbers represent. Oh, okay, I see. So 8, 9, 10, and 11, if you look, all of those places are very close to the ocean. So we have a high amount of salt in these particular areas. So this data suggests that this LAP94 allele conveys some particular advantage to the organisms that contain it. So in this particular environment. So this is an example of natural selection at work. Genetic drift is one of my favorite forces of evolutionary change because this is a change in the population, all right? So a change in the frequency of traits in a population due to chance events. This is totally random change. It is not selective, meaning the organisms that survive are not at a better advantage. It was literally just chance that those organisms happened to survive. Let's pretend we have a beetle population, a small beetle population in a container here. And let's say there are a whole bunch of different types of beetles or colors of the same species of beetles, excuse me, if you will. And let's say your little sibling accidentally dumps some of them out of the container and steps on them. Well, now we have significantly fewer beetles, all right? And maybe your other younger sibling dumps some more beetles out and steps on those. Okay, go ahead and take a look at the numbers at the bottom compared to the original population. You'll see here by chance, just by chance, we had an initial frequency distribution. They were all spread out pretty equally. We had the same number of beetles, if you will, of each type of coloration or variation of that particular beetle. And then if you look, after the first dump, we see a huge change in frequency. Now about 40% of the population is blue, and 20% is red, and then very small amount of the population is yellow, and that was just due to chance. It was just dumping them out because of the small population size. And then if you look again after the second quote-unquote dump, you see a higher population of the red beetles. Um, and so this is interesting because the population definitely changed over time. Look at these allele frequencies. Did they in fact change over time? Yep, we've got different generations. These are different beetles, if you will. These are not the same beetles. These are simply the beetles that were left over. Um, and after reproduction, this is what we came up with. And so you can see that the change in allelic frequencies have in fact changed over time. Therefore, this would be an example of genetic drift. It is important that you understand this question and its answer. So genetic drift has a greater effect on smaller populations. Why might that be? A specific type of genetic drift is known as the founder effect. So this is when a new population is started by a small group of individuals. Often what we'll see is genetic drift becoming a result of that. So some rare traits might be at a high frequency or even fixed at 100%, whereas others might be missing because only a small number of the original founding population just so happened to begin to move to a new space or found a new area. And so the founder population, we might see after several generations, the loss of some alleles take place. So this is very common in populations, both physical and reproductive. You should think about why that is. Polydactyly is common in the Amish in Pennsylvania, and that can be explained by the founder effect. Another example of genetic drift is the bottleneck effect. This is when a large population is drastically reduced by a non-selective disaster, meaning it was a random disaster. So famine or a natural disaster like a hurricane or a tornado or a wildfire or loss of habitat causes loss of variation by that chance event, and it's going to narrow the gene pool. So maybe your original population had a decent amount of variation. After that chance event, maybe a natural disaster or a lot of hunting, for example, only a certain number, a small number of organisms actually survived from that original population. And even after a lot of breeding and generations, the surviving population now has lost some of its genetic diversity, which is not good because genetic diversity is beneficial to populations of organisms. Actually, cheetahs have been through two bottlenecks in recent history. So the first was a recent ice age, if you will, and the second was overhunting. And so living cheetahs, it turns out, are as genetically similar as two identical twins would be to each other. So imagine what problems might this cause. I want to remind you again about the definition of evolution, and that is the change in genetic characteristics of a population over time. So if we're going to define it that way, gene flow is just the change in frequency of traits in a population due to immigration or emigration. This is probably the easiest to understand because if you have two separate populations of organisms and you have movement between those populations of the same species, you are going to have the frequency of alleles change in that original population over time. It is important that gene flow does tend to reduce genetic differences between those populations over time. Finally, our last discussion is about sexual selection. And so what that is a change in the frequency of traits in a population due to gender preferences. So this is selective change because those organisms are being selected for. It may seem maladaptive, meaning why would this peacock have these giant feathers when that could actually draw in predators? And the answer is, well, because it increases its fitness in terms of reproduction. I do want you to take a look at this video whenever you have a chance. I can't show it here, but please do watch it. It's pretty funny. The last bit of information as it relates to sexual selection is sexual dimorphism. So this is the differences between genders within a species. It's indicative of the effects of sexual selection and indicates that the organisms are under selective pressure.